Hello, everyone. Just 1 second. Okay. I'm sure more people will filter in, but hello, welcome. I am Rustin Zarkar. I am the Middle East and Islamic Studies librarian here at the UNC Libraries. Welcome to our annual Horner-Jarrahi Persian Studies lecture series. And today we have a fantastic presentation, and presenter today, Dr. Manakia, is with us today and will be presenting on her latest book, Persianate Selves, Memories of Place and Origin Before Nationalism. And this was published by Stanford University Press in 2020. So before I begin, I just want to introduce our speaker a little bit more in detail. So Dr. Manakia is an associate professor in the Department of Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. Her interests include the connected social, cultural, and intellectual histories of West, Central, and South Asia from the 17th century to the 19th centuries. And for those of you, if this is your first time to our Horner-Jarrahi Persian Studies lecture series, I just want to give you a little bit more information about it. This is a fantastic annual program that has been organized by UNC Libraries through the generous donation of Shada and Vance Horner, who are the donors of this gift. And it was established in 2018, and it provides resources for public lectures at the university libraries in celebration and in recognition of Persian and Persianate studies, history, and culture. So without further ado, I just want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Manakia. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. And it's unfortunate that we weren't able to meet in a physical space, but it's still a pleasure to see your face.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Rostin, and the University Libraries and Persian Studies program at UNC Chapel Hill for the invitation, and to Katie Fanfani for organizational support. I was sorry not to come in person too, but I understand things are really hard to kind of project in the future and plan about sort of what's going to happen when. Okay, so I'm going to, I need to share my screen. Can somebody enable that for me, please?
Sure, I think we can do that right now. And in the meantime, I just want to let our participants know that the way this will work is Dr. Kia would give her a presentation for the next 40 or so minutes. And then after that, I will ask a few questions, but in general, you are free to answer any questions, ask any questions at any time near the Q&A, and I'll be sure to address them and forward them on to our speaker today. So thank you all once again for joining us. And Dr. Kia, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, so this is the cover of the book. And I know that this is, or maybe I'm assuming, but this is a Persian studies audience. But I think some broad background might be helpful, since some of what I present may be unfamiliar to those of you who focus on Iran. So perhaps you may know that Persian was a dominant language of the Islamic East and used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. So increasingly from the 13th to the early 19th century, it was a language of power and learning across Central, South, and West Asia, used for government, philosophy, Sufi literature, historical commemoration, storytelling, poetry, and ethical literature. As a result, a heavy and continuous circulation of people, texts, practices, and ideas connected Persianate Asia. And all of these things are sort of well outlined in scholarship. So here's a map. And so my book is not the story of empires, but here's the political state of things in 1700. And the part that is my contribution is what I argue that we must understand from it, that this mobility sustained a shared cultural hermeneutics across these regions that could be taken up by rulers to form imperial ideologies, utilized by merchants in everyday transactions, or invoked by mendicants in their peregrinations. So one of the things that I emphasize is that Persianate sensibilities had to be acquired because one was never born with them. So Persians were thus a kind of person who had received a particular form of basic education that imparted the Persianate, through which they understood and engaged with the world. Persian was a textual corpus whose encapsulated meanings also lived and circulated orally in stories and verse for broader audiences. Persians learned adab through these verses and stories, how to behave at appropriate moments with gratitude or generosity, when it was called for and towards whom. So adab was the proper form of things and of being in the world. This concept, and you can gloss it as proper aesthetic and ethical form of thinking, acting, and speaking, and thus of perceiving, desiring, and experiencing, provided the coherent logic of being Persian. So this is, and I realize it's kind of fuzzy, but this was the best I could do. But this is the original painting that I used for the cover of my book. And it's from the early 17th century commemorative text of Akbar Padishah, the Timurid ruler of Hindustan. It remembers how Akbar's father, Humayun, sought refuge in Safavid Iran with Shah Tahmasp, who gave him the support to get his kingdom back. This episode and the relationship it created was commemorated in complementary and contested ways through the decades that followed through the 18th century. And I talk about some of these in the book. The adab required by this relationship, depending on how it was depicted, was a potent site for political and moral claims of the two empires, culminating in Nader Shah's evocation of it as the basis for his invasion of Hindustan in 1739. In this particular representation, in a trans-regionally known text, Tahmasp receives Humayun in front of his capital of Ghazvin. It's a site of seamless coming together in the form of a shared culture, but it's also one of contestation, right? In this version, Humayun wears his own royal cap rather than the Safavid Taj he controversially was said to have accepted in exchange for Tahmasp's help. So both rulers are depicted as seated next to each other, closely turned towards one another in intimacy, and both holding the handkerchiefs that would have identified them as beloveds and masters of this audience, foregrounded and framed as they are in the picture by their entourages. So I've been captivated by this image for a number of years and thought this simultaneous homologous and contestory distinction was a perfect representation for my book. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. This is a better map, I think. It's the one from my book, which I took pains to have drawn without political borders, but with cities and domains large and small that are discussed in the book depicted. So just to take a step back for a minute, in general, the main question animating my work is what kinds of histories, meaning worlds, ties, and divisions do we see when we look beyond nationalist and regional frames to the thick and deep paths connecting various parts of Asia together? I realize that speaking of connections across Persianate Asia runs the risk of romanticizing a cosmopolitan pre-modern. But I was writing in the context of scholarship that assumed divisions, and knowing what was shared seems essential to a truly historicized understanding of what was not. So the term Persianate has been used in a variety of ways to describe the distinct political and cultural formations and their intellectual and literary corpus, characterizing Eastern Islamic domains. When I began my work, Persian studies was located in and bifurcated by regional studies divisions. So the domain of Persian was part of the Iranian national subset of Middle East studies, and Persian in South Asian studies was called Indo-Persian, was treated separately, both from Persian in the Middle East and also from things Indic, although there was some attempt to show that, Indo-Persian was really Indian because it had some Indic things in it. So although transregional studies are gaining prominence in their own right, these national and regional divisions are still institutionally entrenched and reflected in separate bodies of scholarship that seldom overlap. New critical attention is slowly enriching this conversation, but methodological nationalism casts a long shadow on historical studies that my work seeks to dispel. The Persianate was an opportunity to think through an intermediary scale of analysis, somewhere between regional and global. And I gained a lot of inspiration from other kinds of intermediary scales that overlapped with the Persianate, like Indian Ocean studies and land-based intra-Asian studies. So when I began reading Persian texts from the 18th and early 19th centuries, first travel texts and then other kinds of commemorative texts, I also saw some disjuncture with the scholarship that existed at the time. And much of what I read, and you have to keep in mind this was now over a dozen years ago, still evaluated the period before the rise of colonial modernity with categories, terms, and understandings belonging to this later period. So this seemed limiting to me because categories are important. And if you begin with too many assumptions, you generally find what you're looking for at the risk of obscuring everything else that doesn't fit and might change its meaning. And anyway, as Sheldon Pollock has pointed out, how can we know what colonialism and its forms of knowing changed if we don't know what was there before? So the work I started doing was in part dedicated to clearing conceptual ground to be able to even speak about what I was interested in. So Persianate Selves presents an argument about what place and origin meant for Persians across Iran and India, and I call this Hindustan, in the 18th century, between the fall of the Safavids in 1722 and when the British abolished official use of Persian in India in the 1830s. So this is something we can call and has been called the end of the High Persianate period, when Persian sort of reached its broadest scope. And specifically, I outline how the expansive and multiple notions of place and of origin allowed for a range of possibilities of collective affiliation, out of which pre-modern Persianate selves grew. And in this work, I bring together texts that are usually understood as separate genres, biographical compendiums or taskeres, travelogues, histories, memoirs, a little bit of poetry under the heading of commemorative texts, based on their shared imperative of commemoration, as well as other common forms and features. The same overarching logic of diversity, of difference legible as coherence, govern the range of possible conceptions of place and origin. Ultimately, I argue that multiple places and origins, a diversity understood as proper and necessary, constituted a range of Persianate collectives and their selves that crossed modern boundaries. So pre-nationalist Persians were from many lands, religions, occupations, social locations, and even genders, though these boundaries possessed aphoretic rather than categorical distinctions that require reassessment of their historical meanings. Okay, so this is the table of contents. What I'm going to do is give you a broad overview of kind of the substance of the chapters. And I'll stop and I will give you specific examples from part 1, from part 2, and a third example from the last chapter, which sort of brings both of the discussions of the chapters preceding it together. So the central premise of place, section 1 of the book, is that the overarching logic of modern empirical geography was but one possible mode of knowing place, because it was embedded in and continuous with other modes of knowing place that were different and even undermined empiricism. We cannot view it as definitive. So the three chapters in this section address the significance of different scales of places, the possible modes of placemaking, and the way places were invested with meaning. So chapter 1, landscapes, begins by outlining the flexibility and multivalence of terms. It distinguishes common ways of understanding units of geographical place, such as kingdoms and provinces, from effective notions of place, such as homelands. The chapter then parses the ways that places were measured and marked. Chapter 2, Remembering Lamenting, illustrates the role of commemorating the near and far past in attributing meaning to 18th century presence, marked by the fall of the Safavid Empire and the devolution of Timurid power for Persians in and between Iran and Hindustan. Different interpretations of contemporary events evince remarkably similar understandings of lands, geographies, and their relation to other places, all with reference to proper ethical forms in learning, service, rulership, social interaction, and piety. And I should say that these similar understandings of the basic categories and relationships occurred even in historical accounts that disagreed with one another about the causality of things, right? So chapter 3, Placemaking and Proximity, looks at the cartographic effects of meaning making and features of place that lent them a moral cast. Widely recognized features of urbanity, learning, just rule, and the storied tradition of Persian and Islamic narratives connected the universal with the local in particular. Transregionally circulating commemorations of place created a morally imbued sense of familiarity and proximity, more significant than empirical geographical contiguity. Other features of place could create a gradient of familiarity with places within and beyond both Persianate and Islamic lands. Let me give you an example now of one way that sort of proximity was made between two places that were not next to each other. So when the Timurids conquered Kashmir and incorporated it into their North Indian-based empire in the early 17th century, they represented it as paradise-like. They then extended its heavenly nature, seen in its lush greenery and temperate climate, further adorned with gardens and pavilions, to characterize the whole of the empire. And there's excellent scholarship on this, most recently by Sunil Sharma. This characterization as the exemplar of paradise on earth became a defining ornament of Kashmir as a place, and incorporated it into universal Persianate knowledge. In the mid-18th century, when Abdul Karim, who was a minor Timurid functionary based in Delhi but born in Kashmir, wrote about his travels through Iran, he used this universally known feature of Kashmir to create linkages with Mazandaran, a small region in Iran, through homology. So though Abdul Karim's affiliation is clearly with Kashmir and Timurid-ruled Hindustan more broadly, the specificity of Kashmir's paradise-like qualities could be extended to other places, could be used to connect with other places. So in his account, local knowledge is something he sifts through, sometimes incorporating, sometimes rejecting, according to more transregionally recognized knowledge about Mazandaran. And he begins his account by stating, it's been heard from credible people that in the past, because of the great number of trees and abundant undergrowth, the way to Mazandaran was extremely inaccessible and oppressive, and travelers had complete difficulty coming and going. Because the Safavid dynasty, especially Shah Abbas, was nobly filled with a desire to regularly visit Mazandaran, they therefore uprooted the trees along the way and built 12 halting stations on a road made of stone and plaster. At every halting station, they built a structure so that it would not be necessary for a tent because of the fact that that rainfall becomes quite heavy there, as is in the case of Bengal. So this is local knowledge, the previous state of the passage between Astarabad and Mazandaran, the changes wrought by the erstwhile Safavids, and information about the climate, which he likens for his audience to Bengal, where many of his immediate readers in Delhi would not have been to either, but would know as a place of heavy rainfall. Furthermore, Abdul Karim transfers the script according to which the Timurids had territorialized their authority to explain the Safavid relationship to their own paradise-like land. He marks Mazandaran's similitude with Kashmir by noting that just as the emperors Jahangir and Shah Jahan would go often with their entourages to Kashmir, likewise Shah Abbas would go to Mazandaran, quote, with some of his intimates and attendants for feasting and enjoyment. So the two places are framed not just by their similar natural beauty, but also because they both act as a paradise-like destination for the contemporaneous kings of two Persianate dynasties who held them in special regard as places to pass certain seasons. Beyond a basis for 17th century Timurid imperial ideology, by the 18th century, this reference to Kashmir was universal Persianate knowledge, and a whole host of people who had never been near it, including Persians writing in Iran, referred to Kashmir as a paradise-like place of temperate weather and heavenly gardens. That a Timurid functionary, such as Abdul Karim, could recognize and articulate this kind of imperial placemaking amongst Safavids speaks to a trans-regionally legible and shared political practice, but also to shared modes of giving places meaning. So with respect to Mazandaran's cultivated places, Abdul Karim waxes lyrical about Ashraf, a site of Shah Abbas's gardens, where, quote, at night the song of crashing waves and the uproar of the sea are heard and are the accustomed sound for the inhabitants. However noteworthy it may be, Abdul Karim nevertheless relates that the locals referred to the Caspian as Gulzum, and that this was wrong. He says that's galat, citing textual sources in support of his authority. So Kashmiri's Persian education, its shared traditions of knowledge, gotten however far away, here corrects local knowledge. And while Kashmiri levels the claim of error, it is not meant empirically in the sense of truth, whose meaning cancels out something else according to a categorical distinction of mutual exclusivity. Following a commemorative tradition of including multiple historical narratives of relative verifiability about the past and its meaning, he still includes this local knowledge as part of what Mazandaran is, in addition to the more universally recognized correct information he provides alongside it. They are both worthy of commemoration. His view of Mazandaran's people is quite sympathetic as well. So after telling us the foods they eat, including their wondrously sweet bread, he claims that the people of Iran tell strange tales with regard to the inhabitants of Mazandaran about their simpleness. More likely, the tales are in spite of the Mazandarani's elegantly adorned characters, and in truth have no basis, or else because, since they call Mazandaran paradise-like, it will be for this very reason. That the people of heaven are simpletons. It is an amazing coincidence that in Hindustan they call Kashmir Jannat Nazir, and in Iran they call Mazandaran Behesh Neshan. And because of these paradise-likenesses, the people of both domains subject the poor Kashmiris and Mazandaranis to much abuse. So Kashmir and Mazandaran are not the same, but their domains are synonymously paradise-like as Behisht and Jannat. Accordingly, the relationship of their inhabitants vis-a-vis the rest of their respective empires and their domain's significance for its imperial rulers is also homologous. Significant here is not Abdul Karim's sympathy toward his subject, but the parallelism he draws between his Kashmiri homeland and the envied and abused people of Mazandaran. It articulates an intimate similitude based on geographical and political homology. His privileging of universal knowledge inscribes hierarchical valuation, to be sure, but including local knowledge alongside and within the framework of homology avoids Orientalism's production of alterity or effacing domestication of what was conflictual and thus threatening. Significantly, Abdul Karim's universalizing amendments to local knowledge were enacted by a Hindustani Persian on a Safavid locality, disrupting anachronistic associations of Iran as the authoritative center of Persianate ways of knowing. But in the midst of this correction, our universal Persian is also simultaneously a Hindi speaker and a Kashmiri empathizing with Mazandarani's plight in Iran. My father's family is Mazandarani. The text reader is clearly in Timurid Hindustan. He provides the name of local flora and fauna in Iran and their Hindi equivalents. And for all that Abdul Karim treats Timurid Hindustan as his Persianate center, his implied reader also has a locality, which he addresses by translating Iran's local knowledge into a Hindustani vernacular. Both scales of local knowledge, that of the smaller domain and of the imperial realm, in turn lie easily alongside trans-regional universal Persianate knowledge. So according to Persianate geocultural understanding, certain places like Kashmir were understood to be paradise-like, whether or not an author had been there or the place was within the domain to which they were affiliated. These understandings could then be extended to incorporate and make sense of other places as related and proximate. Okay, so the chapters in part 2, Origin, examine the meaning and labor of origins among Persians in Iran and Hindustan outside the binary of native and foreigner. I begin with a common assumption that a homeland in the Safavid kingdom established a primordial Proto-Iranian loyalty that marked all migrants to Hindustan, even those in Timurid imperial service. So modern scholarship possesses limited conceptual means by which to understand origins outside of mutually exclusive categories taken to be definitive of affiliation. In these kind of understandings, place is given prominence along with religion, nationality, and ethnicity. As with place, I argue that modern categories are either not definitive or else entirely inappropriate. So in chapter 4, lineages and their places, I argue that the form of origin was lineage, multifariously constituted. So alongside territorialized notions of origin, were often far more important lineages, including those of service, learning, aesthetics, and practice, which call into question our understanding of meaningful connection. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from two 18th century Persians writing in Aurangabad. And this is Aurangabad. So the first is Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami's biography of Morshid Quli Khan Mahmud, which demonstrates the way learned lineage fits the overall story of origin. His original name is Mirza Lutfullah. His father, Haji Shokrullah Tabrizi, entered Hindustan from the land of Iran and established his residence at the port of Surat. Morshid Quli Khan was born in Surat. After he had arrived at the age of cognition, he was at the service of Agha Habibullah Isfahani, one of the established men of learning resident in Surat, who was one of the senior students of the prominent Safavid scholar Agha Hussein Khansari. So born in Surat, Morshid Quli Khan had links elsewhere. He was the son of a migrant from Safavid domains, educated by another migrant in Surat, who was a student of one of the most illustrious late Safavid ulama. The benefits of this kind of service included location in a learned lineage that appears across Hindustani domains. Agha Khansari's students were all over. The other half of the entry mirrors these exalted origins, and I don't have it here, but there are all sorts of details of illustrious patrons and high positions in Bengal and Hyderabad. But here, late Safavid learned lineages are rooted in the Persianate sites of the subcontinent. So learning and service were amongst the important lineages that commemorated origin. And here's another example, and I'm going to talk a lot about Lakshmi Narayan, and I'll call him Shafiq after his pen name. So in the preface to his Tazkere, Gol Rana, Lakshmi Narayan describes himself as pen name Shafiq, Aurangabadi, who from the beginning of eternity has His Excellency Azad Bilgrami's brand of slavery on his forehead. And you could, Azad Bilgrami is the person who I read the previous quote from. Writing in Aurangabad, Shafiq identifies himself as Aurangabadi, which when uttered in that place seems to indicate an immutable and autonomously native identification. Yet Shafiq is speaking to an audience broader than his own locale. He calls himself Aurangabadi, speaking to Persians from elsewhere or in another locale. He introduces himself with a proper name, a pen name, and a place name moniker before distinguishing himself as literally marked by his teacher. Sayyid Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami is the noted poet, scholar, and participant of the prominent Naqshbandi Taqiyya of Aurangabad. Shafiq's relationship with his teacher is a lineage of knowledge, part of his origin. So later in the entry, the biographical entry of himself, before any mention of his own birth, he narrates this story. And it's quite long. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I will leave it up for you. But I think what's sort of interesting is the beginning and the end, right? Shafiq, pen name Lakshmi Narayan Mathur, the author of these pages, is of the Khatri Kapur people. His grandfather, Bhavani Das, accompanied Alamgir's camp from Lahore to the Deccan. He laid the colors of settlement in Aurangabad and entered into the relationship of service, Sighe Nokari. And it sort of goes on to talk about his son, who he was educated by, and how the son, who ends up being Shafiq's father, in the time of Nawab Asaf Jah, he, Mansaram, was appointed to the deputyship of the administration of the 6 subas of the Deccan. And until the time of writing, he continues in this work for what is now 40 years. And I think you can also see here, right, the discussion of how he sort of acquires a mansab, a rank, at the request of Azad Bilgrami, right? So this is the relationship with Shafiq's father, and then Shafiq and his brothers actually are given as students to Azad Bilgrami in exchange. So favored with the deputyship of the paymastership of the Deccan, he incorporated service to the dervishes with service to the nobles. He always observed the manner of conferring the kindness of favors, and my father accomplished both forms of dignified service according to all of the necessary customs. So Shafiq's origins are in terms of what we would call jati, or it's been translated often as caste, which is not a term he uses, and paternal ancestry, alongside and intertwined with lineages of teachers and patrons. His origins and their names come together to make him a Hindu, a Timurid administrator, and a Persian man of letters. Prominent in this story is his father's mastery of adab as social ethics, appropriate to his social location in imperial administrative service, which is a product of many other relationships. Rai Mansaram's perfect enactment of the expected customs of conduct towards all kinds of people, from the masters of the hidden world, dervishes, to those of this manifest world, nobles, indicate the basis of Shafiq's own learned potential as a master of adab. Shafiq's account of his origins is typical in its primary emphasis on genealogies and in the specifics of his occupation. In the midst of these origins, place appears, but does not alone constitute origin. Rather, place was almost always bound up in other kinds of lineages and almost never singularly given. Okay, so chapter 5, Kinship Without Ethnicity, looks at pre-modern notions of social collectives, commonly known as tribes or ethnicities. Dispensing with these terms, I historicize social collectives through the adab of their telling. I find connection between various lineages of birth, legal status, and other formally socially regulated relationships. The variety of lineages constituting origin requires a reconsideration of kinship that dislodges law and birth as definitive. A historicized reading of origins thus defies modern categories like nation, ethnicity, or tribe, and requires instead a reconsideration of kinship that dispenses with anachronistic notions of biological truth. So, I mean, the argument is basically that kinship was part of a large continuum that definitely exceeded both biology and law. So chapter 6, naming and its affiliations, takes the previous chapter's more expansive notion of kinship and considers the ways in which naming captured the possibilities of affiliation. And in particular, I elaborate on the regionally specific ways in which Persians called themselves and each other, and how trans-regional circulation accommodated such specificities in the lineaments of the universal. Names of both individuals and collectives linked people to groups and to each other in ways that were relational, contextual, and thus belie the discrete mutual exclusivity of modern categorization. So, changing political and economic factors in the 18th century challenged social connections and collective affiliation, raising the stakes for commemoration for societies facing fracture and reconstitution in both Iran and Hindustan. So the last chapter, commemorating Persianate collective selves, focuses on Tazkira writing in the aftermath of imperial devolution, kind of focusing on the insight they offer into possibilities for articulating collectives and selves. And specifically, I look at poetic Tazkiras, which commemorate aesthetically and socially constituted collectives of Persians. And these included past and contemporary poets as part of an imagined community of ancestors and peers in which were nested networks of social relationships. So the act of writing such a text was autobiographical, but the self of Persianate autobiography was accumulated and continually redefined in the context of social relationships over a lifetime of learning, travel, and service. These texts evince a self in situ, figured according to Adab's imperatives of moral self-fashioning, continually reiterated in conduct in connection with the world. And that basically means that you were who you were was embedded in and defined by your relationships. So the sheer number and diversity of such Tazkiras enunciate the many possible ways these collectives could be imagined and themselves brought into meaning. So this was a Persian who could be affiliated with a multiplicity of places and have diverse origins that little resembled those demanded by nationalism. So in the time that remains, I'll focus on what was at stake in commemoration. So the very act of remembering, right, brings together memories in particular ways. Moreover, commemoration is an act of memory undertaken together. The commemorative texts that are the sources of this book recollect various assortments of figures, inviting readers to join their authors in acts of remembering. Commemoration had a moral stake as well, and memory served to maintain mindful awareness, a deliberate action that made it a guarantor of morality, which required discernment and judgment. To act correctly in a given situation, one had to be able to remember from previous knowledge and experience. In turn, cultivating moral integrity guarded against memory's loss. So adab, as proper ethical and aesthetic form, manifested a self's moral integrity through proper behavior and collective moral integrity through proper order or governance. So one exemplary form of commemorative text, Tazkiras, blossomed in the late 15th century Timurid Herat. Either standalone or contained in court chronicles, Tazkiras vaunted the learned figures that adorned the courts of Persianate empires. Tazkiras appeared in clusters where unstable times led to the need to record lives worthy of remembrance. They could also assert new polities and new communities, right? So these lives and the collectives they commemorated were collectives of adab that manifested moral order. In times of upheaval or transition, when moral lives were more difficult and an ethical subject's connection more challenging to maintain, Tazkiras preserved moral possibilities for better times. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, as imperial structures began to unravel through the 18th century, the writing of these texts proliferated. Similarly, when new regional polities, really kind of across Persianate Asia, were establishing themselves in the early 19th century, you also saw the proliferation of Tasketa writing, even though that came to a halt sometime in the middle of the 19th century in South Asia. Commemoration's moral significance point to its political stakes. Tasketa has provided collective moral possibilities, and in their very multiplicity, each collective was more than itself. Its figures could and often did belong to other collectives. A poet was also a statesman or a Sufi, a poet of Esfahan and of Delhi. Hindus and women were hierarchically differentiated from, but nevertheless placed separately or together with Muslim men. This supple and expansive plurality, engendered by aporias of being and belonging, allowed collectives to reassert themselves when the political structures that sustained societies failed. So I want to kind of talk about one example. So the poetic Tasketa was just one type, right? And knowledge of poetry and the ability to compose linked a wide variety of occupational classes and social positions. But unlike Tasketas centered on mystics or scholars, which focused on types of Islamicate communities across languages, Tasketas fixed on courts, which focused on geographically defined political communities, poetic Tasketas explicitly attended to an aesthetically and socially constituted collective of Persianate adab. So their very scope and delimiting logic staged the diverse ways that collectives of adab could be imagined, and the forms of Persianate selves these collectives could authorize. So I'm going to give you one final example. So Lakshmi Narayan, Shafiq Aurangabadi, wrote more than one Tasketa. And his full commemorative project kind of exemplifies the expansive potentials of community. So the text that we looked at before, Golerana, was written in 1768-69 from Aurangabad, and it offers a vision of the way geographically located collectives fit together in a broad Persianate space. So Shafiq describes his Tasketa as concerned, this one, yani the Golerana, describes his Tasketa as concerned with, quote, versifiers born and raised in Hindustan, meaning those nightingales for whom the flowers they sing among is this garden. Among those he commemorates are Mughals, who are migrants and their descendants in Hindustan from Iran and Turan. The text is divided into two sections, right? The first on Muslims and the second on Hindus, and he includes an entry on himself in the second section. To understand the place of these versifiers of Hindustan, we need to look at the larger commemorative project, of which this was the middle installment. So he was also the author of Chamanistan Shoara, which was on Rikhta poets, and Sham Qariban, which was concerned, Rikhta is an earlier form, or what Urdu used to be called. And Sham Qariban was concerned with, quote, people who came to Hindustan from elsewhere. He notes that in the introduction to the latter, after writing Golerana on the poets of Hindustan, he realized he needed to write another Tasketa, quote, another fresh sapling added to the path of discourse opposite the first sapling about this particular group, meaning the poets who came to Hindustan. Different kinds of collectives adorn the garden of Persian discourse of Sokhan. Hindus and Muslims, poets born here, and those who came from other Persianate regions. Place or lineage was not determinative. Only multiplicity was overarching. From near or far, the distinction is not necessarily hierarchical. For instance, at the beginning of Sham Qariban, he says, quote, the first of the high ones who entered paradise-like Hindustan is Adam, right? And by this he means the father of mankind, who is also a poet. His original residence was heaven, and though there is debate about where he alighted to earth, Shafiq cites the Quranic account as authoritative and provides an interpretation of the relevant verses to mean that he alighted on Sarandib, Hind, or the Ceylon of Hind, today's Sri Lanka. Quote, and from there he lived here until the end of his life. So this is a common story repeated in Persianate texts since at least the 16th century, but with Shafiq's ability to verify it, according to the Quran, its traditions of interpretation, and Arabic philology in general, a mode of narration is connected with its origins, particularly with his teacher, Azad Bilgrami, who was also a noted Arabic and Hadith scholar. So we know that Shafiq, as a Hindu, was very well versed in these sciences. So Gul-e Rana presents a collective organized by birth in Hindustan, even if subdivided into those who are poets defined by Islam and those who are versifiers defined by idols. Wait. Sorry, my PowerPoint fritzed out for a minute there. Okay. So Persian has other words for idol, but Shafiq uses the word used for beloveds in poetry, connoting that they are as beautiful and worthy of devotion as asnam, or idols. Besides the sophistication of writing this rhymed prose, this articulation offers a parallel. Mozunan literally means those who harmonize, as in writing in metered verse, and nokte pardazan literally means those who make subtle distinctions. Both qualities are integral to composing verse and are often used as synonyms for poets. Together, they are the two operatic qualities necessary for verse, its substantive subtle points and its formal harmonious arrangement. Their adjectival counterparts, Hindus and Muslims, articulate the verse of Hindustan distinctly but together, according to the epistemology of Persianate adab. Shafiq can represent these two groups in a single tazkere called Gul-e Rana, fresh flowers. Envision it as a beautiful new shoot placed along one side of a garden path, facing another sapling, the counterpart tazkere of poets who came to Hindustan from other lands. Both plantings are in addition to Shafiq's first tazkere of Rikhta poets or Urdu poets called Chamanistan, or Verdant Meadow, also written in Persian, as a mini plot ensconced within this larger garden of discourse, or Sokhan. So those are the tazkeres again. The garden is Persianate Hindustan through its paths, though its paths went through other gardens as well. In its soil grows Persian and Rikhta poets born here and elsewhere, distinguished by their idols, and elsewhere he calls them hunud, or their Islam. Not all lived out their lives in Hindustan, and such rigid exclusivities were unnecessary. So these selves were Persians, but Persian was not people from a place called Persia, which is something that only exists in European languages, nor was it an attained truth for an individual or even for a collective. It was a self that required continual and communicable identification. Instead of Persian as an identity, which I try very hard to avoid, we can consider adab as the mode by which Persians identified themselves, always in connection with others. So as I hope is made clear, Persianate Selves makes a claim for what it meant to be Persian before nationalism, but also addresses itself to the violence and exclusions of modern nationalist politics and the limitations of its forms of knowing. Ultimately, my contention is that we cannot find our way out of the conundrums of the present by only looking within modern limits. I wanted to look at an earlier time when ways of seeing and being in the world were different, not to return to them, but as inspiration for imagining new futures. So I also consider the book a beginning, an opening invitation rather than a definitive word. And I'm interested in your thoughts and questions, as a number of the aspects of the argument about circulation, about adab, and about how they constitute the Persianate world in material and imaginative terms are more explicitly addressed in the next book that I'm working on. So I'm happy to talk and discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mana, for that wonderful presentation. It was amazing to see your presentation on this book, which I've had a great time reading, and it's just a pleasure to hear you talking about it. So I just want to remind our audience members to please put in any questions that they may have in the Q&A, and I'll be sure to read them. In the meantime, I do have some questions for you, Dr. Kia, if that's acceptable. The first question actually is somewhat related to, this image that you chose to open the book with, which is, as you mentioned, Tahmasp meeting Humayun in what was then Safavid Iran. And what I find very interesting, and possibly the reason why you made you selected this image was, in contemporary modern notions of ethnicity and nationalism. One, especially if you are growing up with sort of nationalist sentiments, you might look at Tahmasp and say, this is a quintessential Persian king. You might look at him and say, this is a quintessential Turkic king from the Caucasus. You could look at Humayun and say, this is a quintessential Turco-Mongol. This is a quintessential Mughal from India. And then, you can go on Reddit or some other online website and people would have these maps of, various imagined nations of where one group of people would have claim to another, right? And obviously this is interesting because during this time, when these two rulers are meeting, they are engaging themselves not just in a particular language, which is Persian, but in a form of adab, as you describe, as a sort of social way of being. And I just wanted to kind of ask you to kind of explain for maybe some of us who are not, Persian studies experts, what this sort of work does. What does it mean for us to reflect on this past? As you mentioned, you talk about, thinking about a future, but in a world when we do have these sorts of irredentist claims to, let's say, breaking up Iran, or, a greater Caucasus, or a greater, as sort of these sort of nationalisms that are built around ethnicity and language work. When people look at the sources, when they look at these rulers that they idolize, how does this kind of fit in with, how is this world kind of dictated? It is changed by, this view of the past. Obviously you're explaining with the work that you're doing, but I just think it is important to kind of think about what Persian studies means in this period. What does it mean to be Persian? So if you could kind of reflect a little bit more on the Humayun and Tahmasp, that would be fantastic.
Okay. There's so much to say about it. It's such a fascinating moment. Because in the actual moment that it happened, right? I could say so much more about this event of Humayun kind of losing his kingdom, right? And being chased out of Hindustan. And part of it was because of his own brothers. And he starts moving westward towards Safavid Iran. And Tahmasp uses this as an opportunity to elaborate in a very kind of lengthy farman how Tahmasp needs to be received, right? And it's actually understood, and there are copies of this farman. It's reproduced wholesale in the Akbarnameh, right? But they're also in majmuas and stuff. There are other copies of it that circulated in Iran. And the Farman basically said, it went very much into detail. This is how you must treat him. This is how many people need to greet him. This is how he needs to be received. This is how he needs to be treated, commensurate with his status as a prince, right? And it was basically, people have argued, right, a tool to be able to, for Tahmasp to set up his own imperial protocol, right? He was basically using the Humayun's kind of reception as a way to establish the court protocol by which his own dynasty needed to be treated, right? Because at this point in time, he's still, things are still a little, the Ghazalbash are revolting. There's all kinds of contenders, his own brothers, and they're still establishing court protocol. And so this becomes, and Humayun is a Timurid. And that means something still. But there's a lot of fighting. Like if you look at the way that the Safavids represent this image, they also talk about it and they speak about them in terms of kinship. They were like brothers, right? I mean, depending on how they want to make it, Tahmasp receives him in a fatherly way or in a brotherly way, right? Depending on who's kind of arguing about their relative statuses. But I think one of the things that's very interesting is that another reason that this image really resonates with me is that a number of years ago, before I had even really started writing this, I remember I went to a conference and a scholar from Iran came and repeated something that I don't think was, I think was quite common to say whether you were from Iran or not, which is that Persians were from Iran and they spoke Persian, and Turks were from Central Asia and they spoke Turkish, right? And that's very much along this kind of language ethnicity line that modern nationalism and national conceptions of history really try and make. And if there are some Persians in Central Asia, they're foreign, right? And I mean, when you actually look at this, I needed to account for multiplicity because on some level, we know these people are multilingual, for instance, right? But we still impose things like native languages so that those are, they're just, Turkish is later and it's foreign, right? And I think that there needs to be a way to kind of understand the way purity is not something that was really a concern here, right? And that there was a different way to kind of accommodate plurality besides just adding a hyphen and adding another incommensurable term to it, right? And that's, for instance, the way in which these different names for Persian came to be. And Mughal is actually a really good example because in English, Mughal has become, you notice I don't use it for the dynasty. That's something the Europeans came up with, the Portuguese started it, right? But Mughal actually in India meant someone who came from Central Asia or West Asia and stayed, and their descendants, sometimes, 3, 4, 5 generations. So this is not like, they would keep some kind of understanding of a lineage coming from far away, but they were also, that's only something that made sense in India, right? And I wanted to kind of give a sense of how that multiplicity and plurality worked, because I think that in all kinds of ways, it disrupts the one-to-one correspondence and kind of mutual exclusivity of, Persians are from Iran and speak Persian. And because that's a very kind of like monochromatic logic that has really gotten us in quite a lot of trouble, right?
Definitely. And yeah, I'm just thinking about, I came from Peshawar just a few weeks ago, and hanging out with a bunch of Qadiri Sufi members and having them kind of read and be able to speak in Persian, Hindko, Urdu, Arabic in a way that, if you were to ask them their ethnicity, I think as Sufis, they would, have a slightly different interpretation of what it means to be from a specific place. But, this sort of idea of, drawing upon various different sources to understand oneself is something that was very clear in these sorts of spaces where, such as a Sufi tariqa or in a khanaga, And it was just kind of, it very much plays into this this sort of idea that you're referring to, this kind of area of multiplicity. And it was just amazing to kind of see what you're describing in, for example, the walls of a place, right? I have another question. I want to thank our audience for sending out more questions, and we will get to them in a second. This is more about a reflection on your ideas about place and local and universal knowledge. And for me, that was so fascinating because, it makes these sorts of claims of this sort of universal Persianate sphere, where one would understand what Mazandaran is, or would understand what Kulzum is, or possibly, a debate over where the Sea of Kulzum is, or, what Kashmir should look like, and those temperate areas. And for me, I was thinking not just of space, but of time, and what it meant and how it intersected with adab as a way of erudition, of understanding. Throughout this entire sort of description of, Mazandaran in 18th century in this text, I was thinking about all the different, geographers and writers through the sort of Persian language tradition of geography, that Astakhri, Masudi, Ghazvini, Hamdallah Mustafi, like, who are also writing about these different areas. And if one is understanding themselves as a person who's familiar with the Persian tradition, whether in Calcutta, whether in somewhere in Konya, in Anatolia, whether in the Iranian plateau, how much does this sort of adab is it not just space, but also how does the historical tradition fit into the development of, let's say, something adab, right? And adab as adabiyat, right? Literature. And I don't know if you could reflect sort of on the foundations of, the local and the universal being part of, not just people who traveled and understood these things, but people who read multiple generations of authors writing and understood these things.
Okay, I'm not completely sure if I understand your question about how the historical narratives fit into adabiyat, right? I mean, adabiyat as we use it did not exist before the 20th century. So the next project is very much focused on adab in a much more robust way. Like I just kind of mention it here, right? And I use it, and I want to develop it as, it's almost like an analytic and heuristic tool, right? To kind of lay out a certain kind of hermeneutical ground. And that does include understanding a different conception of time, right? So one of the things I kind of show is that empiricism isn't really going to help us that much, right? Like they're not sitting there with maps being like, that's far away, this is close by, right? This is more familiar. This is ours, and that's foreign. So that's really not how it works. Space-wise, right? But one of the things I came to after I finished this book, and actually before I finished this book, it was a much bigger manuscript. And I pulled out, and I was told in no uncertain terms by my publisher that it's too long. So I had to take quite a lot out, including several chapters. And one of them talks about, it develops this idea of Persianate sensibilities a little bit more, and specifically talks about how we need to kind of understand that for these people, they could fold space and collapse time, right? And time also did not work in this kind of linear emplotment. So when they were talking about what was contemporary to them, they could be talking about 100 years ago. Right. And the things that we call the past, which is the distinction between the past, relies on a certain distinction between what is over and gone versus what is current, did not exist in the same way. Right. And being able to really understand that is important. And that's something I try to do when I think about, in the next book, really when I think about the relationship between the material and the imaginary, and looking at the way that there are all of these narratives about, Hafez coming to somebody in a dream and, kissing them on the forehead. And then he wakes up in the morning and starts writing poetry. in the 18th century, right? As well as like these kind of ideas where somebody who had never been, beyond a particular locale, writes and recounts all of these lataif, right? About people who never came to India or who lived 100 years ago that he never met, or right. But they're important people because they circulate in the imaginary of the milieu that he's in, right? And they inhabit it with him and with his readers. So, I mean, I don't think that there's I think one of the things we don't know is what are those circuits, right? I mean, I'm looking very much at a particular time. And, for the second book, I sort of expanded it a little bit into the 17th century to look a bit earlier, before empire collapses. But we don't know what the circuits are, right? Like, when one of the things that I did find is that after the collapse of the Safavids, there's much less circulation in Iran than there continues to be in India. And there's a lot of lamenting for lost libraries. And that people have lost touch with each other and lost their books and lost their narratives to a degree in Iran that doesn't happen in India. And that does something, right? But we don't know who reads what and what kinds of texts remain current and what kinds of stories that aren't always limited just to texts, and where they circulate, right? And I think that would be a very interesting thing to think about.
Definitely. You actually preempted my next question about, who were these people, where were they, how were they communicating with one another, what was this sort of exchange network? So it's good to know that hopefully that work can be done in the future and somebody can answer some of these questions that you posed. I do want to bring in some of the questions from the audience because they are very much related to the discussion we're having. And one of the questions is by Bruce Lawrence, who asks, can you say more about the relationship between the two descriptors, Persianate and the Islamicate? Is it merely a matter of religious identity or also cultural connections that elude religion, but not language or moral values such as adab?
I mean, there's been a lot of work on, everything from Shahab Ahmad's What is Islam to the recent work on the Persianate. There's a kind of unfortunate tendency in South Asian studies to want to make Persianate secular, which is kind of patently absurd. But there's also a kind of moment where Shahab Ahmad decides that, like, we can't call this Persianate, what he calls Islam. He's like, we can't call it Persianate because, that's ethnocentric. Like, all of a sudden he got very lazy, right? He spends a lot of time talking about Islam is not just a culture or just a religion, but like but Persian's not an ethnicity either. And it's a little bit of a problem, I think, for his argument, because, the kind of moment that the Balkans to Bengal complex collapses is when Persian collapses as a transregional language, right? But my kind of understanding of the relationship is that Persian was an Islamic language, but it didn't always have to be. Right. And that there could be a moment where somebody who is Hindu in India and sort of for the next book, I'm looking not just at kind of Persian as it circulates among non-Muslims, I'm also looking at kind of Judeo-Persian texts in Iran to just not have it be, because one of the problems also in South Asian studies is that India becomes this like really special place where everything that happens there is just because of India. And there's a really great article called The Hidden Hand of the Indic about the way this works. But I think one of the things that is important to remember is that Persian was for many, many people Islam, but its kind of ideals and moral values could be kind of universalized in a particular way. And Islam was the best form of those moral values and ideals, but it was not limited to them. And it sort of allowed for the possibility to inhabit them and not be Muslim. And that's a potential that I see being embodied and fulfilled quite often in the sources that I look at. I don't know. I hope that sort of answers. So I think that they're related, but here's my actually, let me just add something. So here's my other issue with Shahab Ahmad's book, right? He goes between the languages very interchangeably. And he talks about there being a common lexicon that is Islamic. And I fully agree with that. But what certain things mean, I do think is specific to language, right? And they're not all shared and they're not all identical, right? The enactment in North Africa or West Africa of generosity or justice may not take the figure of Anushiravan, right? And it doesn't have a certain set of stories and linkages to places and practices and embodiments that are exactly the same. And I think that it makes a difference, right? I think that specificity of language and its tradition makes a difference. Now, I think one of the things that's the most amazing about this is that people were multilingual usually. Even if they weren't educated, people were multilingual, but they didn't all have the same idea just because they were Muslim of how everything worked and looked.
Excellent. This is a follow-up question from an anonymous asker in the audience, and it's regarding the relationship between Islam as a religion, culture, with religion, either Islam or Hinduism. And the question is, in the South Asian case, a number of non-Muslim figures also partook in the Persian literary culture. So arguably, they were also constructing their selves in the same discourse. Would you still categorize these as Persian itself?
Yes. And I did show, I spent a rather long time on Lakshmi-Narayan, and he is not Muslim, right? I think that's important, but I think the difference between the modern conception is they were also other things, right? They were also Hindi selves. They were also Rishta selves. And, you didn't have to be, one didn't have to be more important than the other necessarily. And I'm sure that they were contextually exchanged. Now, Lakshmi-Narayan was a Munshi. And so I think that was a very large part of his self-understanding. But we also know that, he was obviously part of an entire familial world too. And that wasn't, and his spoken languages were multiple. And so we also know, for instance, he was in constant conversation with Marathi speaking Munshis that were part of the Maratha state. So, I mean, there might have been a different set of norms gauging their interaction. And, he wasn't writing in Modi, but he could speak Marathi. So, I mean, I think that it's okay to call them Persians too. And I think it's important to kind of understand you didn't have to be Muslim. I mean, this is an interesting issue, partly because the situation, bringing this kind of argument to Iranian studies and to Iran, it has very different stakes than bringing it to India, right? In India, Muslims really need to prove that they're native to India. And basically, both Islam and Persian are foreign. And this is actually a very, very strong basis for the kind of disenfranchisement that is taking place, if not outright ethnic cleansing, right? And my issue is that in the context of South Asia, I don't want to concede the ground of what is foreign and what is native. Native is not Indic, right? Persians were in Persians were in Hindustan, but Persian is not someone from Persia, right? It's something that someone could inhabit. And many people did who had nothing to do with Iran. And those were Persians too.
Excellent. And speaking of Richter, as you mentioned in your previous answer, Karen Pinto has a question regarding Richter, and also a second question too. So the first question is, when does the name of Richter drop away and that of Urdu start? And then the next question is, you mentioned Turan or Turan. Can you tell us about the discussion and the understanding of Turan?
Okay, so Richter, I mean, it's funny. The first taskere that we have is Mir Taqi Mir's taskere of Richter poets. And he actually says this is the taskere, I can't remember the exact wording, of Richter poets. Richter is the language of Urdu Mu'alla, right? Like the exalted camp, the language of the mixed language of the exalted camp. And it comes to be called Urdu after the second part of that description. So Urdu as a kind of word associated with that language is always there, but Richter kind of falls away. I think it's somewhere I think it's right around when Persian becomes dropped by the British, right? When they replace it as a language of government, that is the same time that Urdu starts being used for prose, because up until maybe the 1830s, 1840s, Urdu is not used for prose writing. Persian still is used for prose writing. So most of the tazkeres that are written of Richter poets are all written in Persian with Richter poetry and verses inside. So I think it's around the same time. That's not something I've tracked exactly, but I'm pretty sure that's right. About Turan, so this took a lot of digging, but Turan is not the same as Mawara al-Nahr, right? Mawara al-Nahr is one of the three regions of Turan. And the other ones are Balkh and Kharaz. And, you know, what's interesting about it is that at one point, someone like Azarbek Deli, who's a kind of Irano-centric guy writing in Iran in the middle of the 18th century, basically says about Balkh, when he's discussing it under the rubric of Turan, he says this used to be part of Iran, but it's been a long time since it's become part of Turan because of who's been ruling it. So one of the things we see there also is that geography isn't like set, right? A lot of different things can happen. And it's interesting. It's not because like more Turkish speakers went there, right? It's about who's ruling it and from where. Like it hasn't belonged kind of this side of to people that are ruling from this side of the line in a long time. And so, you know, now it's part of Turan.
Interesting. We have another question from Mehdi Shadmer, who is a professor here, and he asks, what is the criteria or the method of selecting sources that constitute the basis of your analysis?
Okay, so, I mean, I kind of came up with this term of commemorative text, and part of it is because even when I was reading things that were like more, I mean, you know, a lot of these texts, these are modern generic definitions. Like one thing is a memoir and one thing is a geographic text and one thing is a travel log, but really they mix quite a lot. And I mean, tazkeres are a little bit easier to discern as a kind of bounded genre. But even when you look in tazkeres, the kinds of sources that they're pulling from and the variety of them, some of them break out into like 20 pages of what looks like a chronicle, what looks like tarikh, right? So even those are sort of mixed and varied, depending on time and place. But one of the things that I started to notice is that in texts, I mean, obviously tazkeres call themselves tazkeres, and that's, you know, announcing commemoration as one of its projects, right, as its kind of concern. But a lot of other texts had either some allusion to this in the title, a text that has been reprinted and called a memoir, calls itself Tazkiratul Ahval, right? So, I mean, memory is being evoked either in the title, or oftentimes when I would read the prefaces of the authors, they would say, I'm writing this so that memory isn't lost. I'm writing this so that we can remember. I felt like that was one logic under which it made sense to bring together a lot of texts, right? The other was the ways that depicting and talking about certain kinds of people, like places were never talked about just in physical terms, right? For a place to mean something, it was almost always peopled, either by people that the person writing about would have met, or the people that made up the character of its past, right? And so, but the way that those stories were told overlapped over genres. And I thought that was significant too, right? So, Azerbaijan is named for Azar, and this was like a prophet, and these are the stories about him, and this is why he gives his name to this place, right? Anyway, that was my logic. I kind of, in a way, and I don't like to use this word, but I was kind of making my own archive, because I find that modern generic divisions and classifications are pretty unsatisfying. And so why not link them in a different way?
Definitely. So we have maybe about 7 minutes left. So I want to leave some time for our audience members to ask any remaining questions that they may have. In the meantime, I do have a question for you, which is something related to how, in your conclusion, you spoke about, imagining a future through looking at the past. Obviously, as you mentioned, not in a way to return to it, but to help us think about a different future. And I just want to ask you, what kind of, based on this sort of project and your next project as well, what kind of future do you imagine, not just for Iranian studies as a discipline, but, for us as members of, the Iranian community, or some of us who are interested in Iran, or, places, or the Persian language? What sort of future do you think we can kind of look towards and kind of hope for?
I mean, my kind of, this book came out of not really liking the way that Persian nationalism and pride in what is, something, a culture and a kind of history to be proud of, depended on constantly asserting difference and superiority to other people, particularly the sort of people that had historically been so close and intimate with it, right? So Arabs, Indians, right? And sort of understanding that there were old linkages and commonalities between these people, and that acknowledging, and I think that, one of the things I wanted to make sure about in my conclusion was to kind of say that this isn't completely obliterated, right? And one of the things I found myself is that once I knew the right questions to ask, almost every Iranian I talked to had some kind of story of connection in their family, in their remembered childhood, in some way, like, we used to do trade with India, and Hindu merchants would come to our house and have dinner with us, right? And just remembering all of this in a way that I feel like helps us collapse the divisions that were given to us by colonial modernity, right? And to create kind of linkages and connections with the people around us, instead of just looking to Europe and holding ourselves up to that, right? Which I don't think, I just read Frantz Fanon with my students today, right? Like, I don't think we should do that.
Definitely. So I'm glad I gave a final call for questions, because we have two more, and we do have time for them. So I would like to read them out for you, if that's okay. So the next question is, can we understand the works borrowed and translated from the Persian world also constructs Persian itself? There are many works in South Indian literary traditions influenced by Persian works. Does the language construct the self, or is it the idea which shapes the self?
That's a great question. So I have students that work on Indian vernaculars, and particularly have traced certain stories into translations, right? And there's been some really great new work on translations. But these translations often are also, not in the word for word rendering, right? They're interpretive translations. And so one of the things that happens is that a kind of Persian story will be taken, and certain points that resonate with the South Indian languages tradition, the story may be told a bit differently, right? Whether that's Persianate, I think it depends, and we'd have to look at those stories more closely. I do think when I've seen and looked at some of the work that my students have done about, for instance, the reception of the Leila Majnun story, right? Nizami or Amir Khosrow's story of Leila and Majnun, sort of how it gets translated into North Indian vernaculars, that is very Persianate. However, there is also a lot of the traditions of those languages at play. And I would just say that it could just as easily be a Tamil self or a Bangla self. But I, again, don't think these have to be mutually exclusive. And the influence did go both ways, right? One of the stories I'm really interested in is Suzogodaz, which is a 16th century Masnavi that gets written about, it's a kind of re-narration of Sati as like a Sufi story and the way that this is wildly popular in 17th century Isfahan, complete with like illustrations and everything. I'm thinking about the way that certain poets, I was fascinated to find certain poets of Georgian descent calling themselves as Takhallus, Brahmin, right? As a way to mark their high status, but the fact it was a way to say I'm outside of this, I'm outside of this tradition, but I'm of a high status, right? I mean, just and this is in Iran, like, so thinking about how these mutual resonances go back and forth, whatever self is there, this logic that I'm talking about isn't necessarily unique to Persian. And I think that having so much transaction between the languages probably means that it resonates with other kinds of adjacent pre-modern language and literary cultures.
Wonderful. And for our last question, this is a follow-up to the question regarding the criteria for analysis. And I think it would be great for, students who are also thinking about taking on a project similarly to this, which is, suppose one focuses on taskeras broadly defined. Did you look for all the existing taskeras in such libraries, or did you randomly select a few, or did you select some famous ones, etc.? Put differently, to what extent can one think about these selves as representative?
Okay, so I've had conversations with a friend of mine who's a sociologist about what makes something representative, right? And this is like a fantasy of positivism. Like, you're never going to have all of them, and which one counts more, right? And in sociology, something you have to give two or more examples of something happening in a particular place for it to be representative, right? So in my thinking, what I decided to do, I mean, I talk about a lot of just tasquetes, right? But obviously there were many more written than I include. But what I tried to do was to make sure that I considered the following kinds: ones who traveled transregionally and left behind many copies, right? And ones that did not travel transregionally, some of which were quite local, right? Especially in the second half of the 18th century, you had a tasquete, written in Benares, written for the local ruler there. I mean, that didn't really go that far, right? But what I wanted to see is if the kinds of things that I was noticing in the trans-regionally circulating tasquetes, and I looked at some earlier texts too that I know, like Amin al-Aziz Haft Eqlim, everyone and their dog cites it in Iran, right? So I know this text traveled a lot. It was all over India as well. And so the question is, and so there's also the question of citationality, right? Are people referencing it? And how are they referencing it? And Azad, writing in Iran 150 years later, is referencing it a lot, right? But I also wanted to look at if the kinds of features that I saw in those texts were also repeated in the tasquetes that didn't really go anywhere, right? That kind of stayed in a small, a smaller, larger regional locale. And I found a tremendous amount of overlap. That was the main issue for me, are the trans-regional ones the same as the ones of some guy writing in Podunk, whatever, right? Who, kind of hopes this will go really far, but maybe doesn't expect it to, or it's just written for tiny Podunk court, right? But what I found is the same kind of sensibilities, the same protocols, as well as always an effort to connect elsewhere. And I'll give you an example, which I thought was fascinating from a younger colleague of mine, Shayan Rajan. Shayan Rajani, he writes on Sindh, and he looks in the 18th century at the regional court there, and he looks at the tasquetes that are produced, and they call themselves tasquetes of Sindh. But the people they include are anyone who came to Sindh and passed through for any amount of time, right? So such and such person comes to Sindh and stays for 3 months and then goes, he's in the tasquete, right? And those are the poets of Sindh. So there's also a kind of way, and these are not tasquetes that really went anywhere, right? But that kind of expansiveness is even there in these tasquetes, and that are explicitly looking at one locale. So for me, it wasn't there's 300, do I have at least 10% of them? It was more about if I could get enough of scales and see the similarities and differences between them.
Wonderful. Dr. Kia, I just want to thank you so much for being with us today. It was a wonderful presentation, and it was great to chat and to have such great, audience feedback. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for these really, really great questions and the chance to come and talk about my book.
Of course. And hopefully one day we will see you in person in North Carolina.
Yeah, inshallah.
Well,
take care, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. That was Dr. Mana Kia, and her book is Persian Itself. And if you are interested in this series, this is the annual Horner-Jarrahi Persian Studies Speaker Series at the library. And tune in next year. We will be having another excellent presentation. So thank you very much. And I would like to thank Katie Fanfani and the rest of the the communications team for organizing and doing the promotional material for this presentation. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day, and see you